Welcome, friends. Welcome to Wadadley TV, and welcome to our Independence Special. As we celebrate 41 years of independence, our show tonight focuses on our path to independence. And our guide for the journey along this path is a very, very, very special guest. I'm Craig Max, alongside Jomo, and you're on Wadadley TV. Ladies and gentlemen, on Wadadley TV tonight, our guest, our special guest, our guide for the journey along our independence path is a real son of the soil. He is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, the University of Toronto, and also holds a master's degree in public health from Tulane University. He is a cultural worker. He is a playwright. He is a director and producer of both theater and music. He's a calypso writer, a judge, and an analyst. And he is a published author of not one, but two books, Send Out Your Hand and Nobody Go Run Me, both available on Amazon. He is one of the vice presidents of the CARICOM Reparations Commission that is spearheading the reparations movement against Europe for their crimes against humanity via the slave trade, slavery, and the genocide of the indigenous peoples. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with the greatest of pleasure that I welcome to Wadadley TV none other than the greatest himself. Put your hands together for Mr. Dorbreen Omar. All right, good sir. Thank you once again for your time. This is a truly a pleasure, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk with us, give us some of those insights. You're a very well-rounded man, and I applaud you for your accomplishments. And I thank you for your time.
Thanks much, man.
Dr. Ahmad, this is Jomo Golston.
Yes, sir.
How are you?
Not doing badly, you know. We had a wonderful day today, perhaps an inch and a half of rain.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been pouring all day. And let me just also warn that we have been having blackouts in and out. So if I disappear at any point in time, it's not of my doing.
It's APUA.
You know?
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure, and I know you to be a legend of all things Antiguan and Afrocentric.
My brother.
So I've been reading your book, which I should recap. It's the Nobody Go Run Me. I found fascinating. I've never seen anything like that. You're telling history, you're writing about history, you're tracking history and teaching history, Caribbean history, through Calypso, and then through the lens and the eyes of one Calypsonian.
Mm-hmm.
That is amazing. That's genius. I'm curious. What possessed you to do that?
No, I've always been, I've always been into Calypso. And if you want to talk a bit about origins, my father was at one point in time, I think, one of the biggest Calypso fans in this country. I also had an uncle, one of the Simpsons up in the factory area. One of my uncles, one was in rhythm and blues and one was in Calypso. So from my very early days, 8, 9, 10, I was listening to the music. I also understood what the music was about, that essentially It was a record of history. And so it was not a challenge for me to be tracking history through the Calypso because it essentially was one and the same thing. Um, the challenge, of course, was to search the music to find some logical progression in ideas of how ideas change in the society or within the Calypso fraternity itself or within the individual Calypsonian. As I said in the piece, what I think I did was a record of Calypso and Antiguan history through the eyes and lyrics of Short Shirt, primarily, because I think towards the end of the book, where he begins to fade slightly, other Calypsonians come to the fore and actually carry on the history. You're quite right. We haven't had too many pieces like this written about it. It was one of the main comments I think I received across the region with the piece, that this was essentially the first time that someone had attempted in this manner and in an as extensive a form as I did to connect, the Calypso and history. It was one of the comments, that I really appreciated.
Throughout the diaspora, music has always been the way that they said our ancestors transposed and transformed messages to each other, even through the antiquity of sleep. And I'm smiling because Nobody Gonna Run Me is my favorite calypso of all the shot. As Craig would say, as a villain man and as a Short Shirt, I was Short Shirt's biggest mascot.
Unofficial anthem.
As a child, I remember, unofficial. I walked around with my towel on my neck all the time because it was my pride. It was my manhood. Yes. And I remember experiencing that song one day as I was about to leave for the United States. And I was on Factory Road coming down the street. And there was this question of regional integration being bantered around on the radio. And people were talking about, too many people from other Caribbean nations in Antigua. And I said to myself, man, we misunderstand the power of togetherness as Black people. And then I thought to myself, that song was so instructive when he said, my mother, he said, my mama must nyam, and Papa must nyam. And at that point, it struck me, we have an intrinsic value of our country and our region that is within our culture. But sometimes our culture gets lost in terms of value. Speak to me about, walk me through the process of thinking when, I don't know what Short Shirt was thinking when he said, this country is mine. And I'm paraphrasing. And he said, nobody gonna run me from where we come from. How do we equate that to our origins here in this part of outside of the African continent? Why are we here? How are we here? And now that we're here, nobody can run out again because we've been running already.
We've been an extremely mobile people. We were mobile historically across the land, across the continent of Africa itself. We moved from country to country, essentially from kingdom to kingdom. We established new kingdoms, depending on weather, depending on the way rivers flowed, depending on how animals grazed. We have always been a mobile people. After the kidnap to the Caribbean, the same thing continued. in that we move from country to country, seeking freedom, seeking better ways of life. We've always been on the move, to the extent that when we think of, the independence of Haiti, when we talk the independence of Haiti, one of the critical aspects of that new Haitian constitution was that any African who landed on their shores became a free person. And then just hundreds of people found their way, hundreds of enslaved persons found their way to Haiti. I mean, we come a bit later down in history. We moved to Cuba, we moved to the Dominican Republic, we moved to Panama, we cut the Panama Canal. And as we get a little closer, a little more modern in time, we moved to Trinidad and Tobago, where oil was, and the economy essentially was flourishing on the basis of oil. We moved to Curacao and Aruba, also around oil. So we have been moving. We have always moved. Resources, and by the time we got to the 60s and 70s, where we know we are moving behind our resources. So we are moving to the United Kingdom. We're moving to Canada, we're moving to the United States, following our resources, following what we have produced, the wealth that we have produced that we no longer had control of. And so it is in that context, I understand the mobility of our people. Now, what does this do? I think the question you asked, what does this do in terms of our own perceptions of ourselves? How do we deal? How do we deal with this particular issue? There are a couple of things, and again, we need to trace them back in history. The movement in the late 1950s to a federation essentially was a call of Caribbean people for unity. It was a call for unity that had existed way back in the 1920s when these conversations started. I mean, and the influence of Marcus Garvey, for example, early 1920s, that would have had on our people here in the Caribbean, which is something that history doesn't record too well, but serious influence on our thinking as African people. I don't like this term of African descendants at all, as though it separates us, so I tend not to use it. So it separates us from the African race. It's not a question of African descendants, it's a question of Africa. But that work now continues through this region, through the 1940s, the Second World War, up to the Federation. The Federation doesn't fail. The Federation was made to fail by the United Kingdom. Full stop. And for too long, we have looked at its failure as a weakness of our movement for unity. But I think, on close examining, the records of the United Kingdom are now coming to the fore. And it becomes very clear that that federation was made to fail. It was not financed properly. The leaders were treated with scant respect. There was absolutely nothing in the concept of a golden handshake to finance the federation, as the United Kingdom had done in the late 1940s in South Asia, where they actually financed through a major financial subvention to Southeast Asia to ensure independence of those countries. And so we move to independence, and I think that if there is failure, it begins here. Because our move to independence essentially was to establish our footprints on this world, to let the world know what we were thinking, what we thought was going on internationally, to give us a voice in the United Nations, give us a voice in UNESCO, give us a voice in this, give us a voice everywhere, so that we could express ourselves. Unfortunately, I think the independence project turned inwards. And in turning inwards, we now started dealing with ourselves our development, our roads, our water system, our electricity, our elections, our heroes, our flag. And I think that that is what happened, that the independence project has turned inwards. We have not yet managed to turn it back. There have been many attempts, I think, to turn it back, to turn it again towards a regional perspective, towards the region talking to the world about what we are thinking. Some of it is happening right now. COP27, I think, is going on. And there are a number of Caribbean countries, including Antigua and Barbuda, who are there for the first time in many years, telling the world what we think about our position in the world. And I really think that that is an important part of the analysis of beginning to understand who we are. You know, the inward turn that came with independence. And I think right now we are experiencing perhaps a better understanding with change in leadership, change in political leadership in many of our countries right now. The leadership of this Caribbean right now is extremely young, you know. Half our leaders are around 50 years of age.
Yes.
It is the hope of individuals like myself who have been out there battling with these issues for some while, that the youthful leadership in this region can begin to again look outwards. Yes. As opposed to that inward focus that I think has consumed us for the last 2-3 decades.
Yeah.
Something you alluded to flashed in my mind. So through the pages of the book, there's some sort of audacity. There's an idea of audacity that comes through as you read through from early to late chapters. For example, overall, you can challenge this or comment on this, but I notice you could probably put the Antiguan experience, maybe even the Caribbean experience or the Caribbean island experience, into several phases of experience. There's obviously slavery, and then there is post-slavery and the colonial era rule. Mm-hmm. And then there's a turbulent period with an invasion, I guess, of the Yankee, coupled with the organization and the industrial activism, the unrest, the picketing, and so on, mm-hmm. pushing back against the establishment. And then there's a small period of statehood, quote unquote, pre-independence, and then independence. So in the I should say this, I don't want to have the conversation about slavery out of respect for just that topic itself, because that deserves serious conversation and further study and a full series of shows like this just about mm-hmm. slavery. So out of respect, I'll put that aside for a second. But starting with that colonial period, you describe Antigua as, let's see, I remember the word scrunting. You describe Antigua as not only a British colony, mm-hmm. but a British colony scrunting in the middle of the Second World War, where forced labor, underemployment, hunger, and disease are still widespread. When you think of that visual of Antigua, poor people, diseased people, having visions and ambitions of being independent, how do we go from that to that? What empowered these people to think that they, in their own squalor, to somehow be this independent, functioning economy?
Well, there are two challenges, I think, in your statement and your question.
Mm-hmm.
One is that we cannot separate the enslavement period from this.
Right.
Because what you are seeing and what you're witnessing of a squanting people are essentially a people living in the jet stream of slavery.
Yeah.
This is what you're seeing. And so any attempt to separate it, I think, sort of falsifies an understanding of the continuity of history. And so for me, I find roots in attempting to diagnose, to describe, to understand that movement that takes place in this region post First World War, Second World War, towards independence. I understand that as being a reaction to the jet stream of enslavement. It is the continuation of slavery conditions under a new form that we call colonialism. I mean, the history, let's jump what, late 1930s, early 1940s. This region explodes. This region explodes, a whole bunch of riots starting in St. Kitts and taking place all across this region. A total rejection of the conditions of colonial government across this region. A couple of things happen. Let's say someone like Professor Arthur Lewis, our economists, etc., says to Britain, hello, man, you have occupied these countries for the last 200-300 years, and these are the conditions that people are living in, and these are the conditions that you've left for them. Well, let me tell you something, Britain. You owe this region for 200 years of free labor. And it is that financing that will help to develop these countries. You owe it to them. So there is that economic, intellectual thought about how do we get out of the squalor of the post-enslavement colonialism that we are living with. Now that becomes inspiring to our people who essentially had known the struggle against enslavement and essentially had won that struggle against enslavement, who understood, and a lot of the leaders at that point in time, including those who had gone to fight in the First World War, people like Cipriani, etc., Captain Cipriani out of Trinidad and Tobago, etc., had seen the outside world, had seen the conditions under which, one, white people in Europe were living compared to the conditions that they were living in, and also had experienced the treatment of white people in the army and around because of their race. And so it is not a single, I don't think we can point to a single factor that enables Caribbean people to think this way. It's a collection of factors, including, and I like to think about who, if we really dig into this history, we can go back to the late 1800s, where the whole concept of Pan-Africanism, etc., emerges. And it emerges as a Caribbean concept. It doesn't emerge as an African concept. If you look at all the leaders of that Pan-African movement from the late 1890s, etc., we find their leaders out of Haiti, out of Martinique, out of the Virgin Islands, out of Trinidad and Tobago. We had Antiguans working with Marcus Garvey himself. And so that thinking and that yearning for freedom and that yearning for Africa actually is a very strong Caribbean sentiment. And I think that is what has propelled us. through then we run into our, well, inverted commas, our modern day heroes. We run into the Birds and the Bustamantes and the Eric Williamses and the Manleys. We now run into these people who themselves are very powerful in their vision of what African people, what Caribbean people can be in this world. So I think in reaction, Craig, one is that I never separate that whole slavery. It cannot be packaged because up to today, we continue to live in that jet stream.
Yeah.
And that is the basis of our reparations struggle, that we can identify out of that slavery and colonial experience. We can still today identify the hurt that continues to be inflicted on us here in the Caribbean.
We'll talk about the reparations part later. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay. But it is that continuum.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm tempted to touch that reparations balloon, but I'm being guided by master control. But I too have that whole sort of question or curiosity, because in my view, the whole idea of the Caribbean and the persons who affected by slavery revolting against colonialism, in their mindset, I believed wholeheartedly that the failure was as a result of them underestimating the power and the mental capacity of these people that we brought from slavery to actually organize themselves and run their own economies. Walk me through that dissension of that idea. People, and I can't help but look at people of your generation as heroes, because this was sort of the manifestation of our African expression, that we were once kings, we were once leaders, we had societies, and this wasn't new to us. And so the fact that they thought that we would fail, I think, did that influence, that sort of ignoring of our existence, of our presence, the lack of financing, and so forth. But we showed a sort of resilience. But again, I agree with you, that whole thread of slavery has poisoned a part of our psyche, because this is something you've gone through for centuries of deprivation. And again, as we master controllers don't want me to go straight into, but this is my question. How do we reconcile those two issues of the lack of financing and our will to succeed under what I call guava crack times? We were just coming out of amelioration and into indentureship, and all of these persons who came to the Caribbean region to sort of solidify this experiment that what is this region going to be like really? How are they going to come together? The fact that they can even read is through our graces. And so we had to transcend all that. And that to me is where Calypso and our culture is key. That connection. I don't want to, like you said, we don't want to say ancestry, because we are Africa. But I'll let you take it from there.
Well, yeah, because we are a part. We became a part of the modern world. We became a part of the modern world. We made contributions to the development of the modern world from the 19th century onwards. Caribbean people have been, influential, have been central in many, many aspects of international development. And I think by after we get to that federation period, we are also quite deeply involved in that what we call, well, there are two movements taking place at the time that we are very deeply involved in. One is the whole socialist movement that develops across this region and across the United States of America, across the world, led by a number of African leaders, and our Caribbean voices are very strong in that. The CLR James, the voices of the CLR Jameses, etc., very strong in that international view. The George Padmores, etc., very, very strong in that international view. So we have been a very strong Caribbean people. We have been a very strong international people. We understand this. And then by the late mid-1960s, the whole Black Power explosion takes place. Admittedly, let's say, taking place in the United States in the first instance. But we are critically a part of it. I mean, not only in its expressions, but in its personage. Of who Stokely Carmichael is. Of who Malcolm X's mother is.
Yes.
You know, and these are Caribbean people we're talking about. And so that sense of us being a part of an international movement for the betterment of African people wherever they are. And then our scholars get in on this, when the Walter Rodneys, etc., get in on this and begin to further, I think, open up our understanding of those connections and who we are and why we are. You know, I mean, we can call all these names, but there are many of them, of our scholars, who have led international thinking on these matters. I mean, this not only makes me proud, but it makes me understand in a certain way the responsibility that my generation and following generations have for maintaining that presence in leadership, in international leadership, of attempting to influence the direction of this world. And so I think that is where it's happening because of who we are. It's happening, and you did mention, for example, this whole question of indentureship, which is another aspect I think that we also need to look at, because it adds another layer. Another thinking in our Caribbean ideology, because we now have to begin to deal not only with an African cosmology, if you want to call it that, but we also have to know to begin to think about Asian, Indian, Chinese, and the types of society that evolves because of the history. I mean, and let's not, I know Craig might want to throw something at me, but let's not also separate that whole question of indentureship from slavery. Because all that happened is that they just brought the Asians, the Indians here, and just put them in the same physical conditions that African people had walked away from. Straight to the plantation that African people had walked away from. So this is this continuum, you know, that I think we need to understand historically. And Craig, don't throw anything.
I'm not going to.